I grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee, surrounded by fields, pastures, and a lot of quiet. My grandmother lived on a distant farm, and her house was always a peaceful refuge, far from everything. The kind of place where you hardly saw cars passing by, and the only sounds at night were the crickets and the wind through the trees. On that particular night, my older brother, Tyler, and I were there to help her with a few things. Everything seemed normal until something strange happened. It was already late, probably around 10 at night, and my grandmother had gone to bed. Tyler and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the complete darkness around us, when he noticed something. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing in the direction of the barn, which was about 100 meters from the house, in the back of the property. My eyes took a while to adjust, but soon I saw it, a faint, steady light. A light that definitely shouldn't have been there. The barn didn't have electricity. It was an old place, mostly used for storing tools and some old junk no one used anymore. The light seemed to be coming from inside, but the strange thing was that the barn had been locked since the last time we used it. Tyler, being the type who hated mysteries, suddenly stood up and went into the house, quickly returning with the old shotgun my grandfather used to keep around. "Let's go see what this is," he said with a tone that didn't allow for debate. We walked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we got closer, the night air suddenly feeling heavier, more tense. When we were about 20 meters from the barn, we heard something. Footsteps. Light, but clearly human. Tyler raised the shotgun and yelled, "Hey, who's there?" There was no answer, just the sound of the footsteps continuing. And then, a figure stepped out from the shadow of the barn, walking toward us. The stranger wasn't running, wasn't hesitating. He just walked, as if he was confident there was no need to worry about the shotgun Tyler was pointing at him. His face was hidden by the darkness, but I could feel the presence of something deeply wrong. Tyler gave another warning, now with a threatening tone. "I'm armed. If you don't stop, I'm going to shoot." The man didn't stop. That's when Tyler decided to act, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound of the shotgun shattered the night's silence brutally, echoing across the fields. The man paused for a second, just long enough for me to think he might reconsider his intentions. But instead of coming closer, he turned around and ran, disappearing quickly into the darkness, beyond the reach of our flashlight. We stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Nobody ever messed with my grandmother's things. This was a town where everyone knew each other, where people didn't even need to lock their doors. What the hell was that man doing there? We went back to the house, still in shock, and spent the rest of the night on edge, waiting for any sign he might return. But the stranger never came back. The real worry came later, though. How many times had he been there, without us noticing? That light in the barn didn't make sense. The place was locked, and only Tyler, my grandmother, and I had a key. Who knows how many nights he had spent watching the house, lurking in the dark while we thought we were safe. After that night, Tyler and I started taking turns staying at our grandmother's house, always armed, always alert. But the sense of safety never returned. To this day, whenever I see a distant light at night, I can't help but think of that man. Who was he? What did he want? And most of all, is he ever going to come back? I grew up in one of those small, forgotten towns, where the factories that once gave life to the place now stand as empty skeletons. At the end of Main Street was an old textile factory, closed for decades. Everyone knew it was dangerous, with crumbling walls and floors full of holes. But to us bored teenagers, the factory had a certain pull. It seemed like the perfect place to test our courage. It was a hot summer night when Ethan, Jake, Claire, and I decided to explore the factory. We had been there a few times during the day, but that night, we wanted to prove we weren't afraid of the dark. It was almost midnight when we jumped the rusty fence surrounding the property and started walking through the main entrance, which no longer had doors. The air inside smelled of mold mixed with rust, and the echo of our footsteps seemed to amplify in the empty space. We walked in a line, using weak flashlights that barely lit the path ahead. The silence was almost complete, except for the distant sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows. At first, everything was calm, just a growing sense of unease from being in a place that clearly wanted to be left alone. But when we reached the center of the building, we heard something that made our blood run cold. A noise, like shuffling footsteps coming from a corridor to our right. We all stopped at the same time, our flashlights trembling in our hands. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. We nodded, not sure what to say. We tried to convince ourselves it could be an animal, maybe a big rat, or the wind moving something upstairs. But then we heard another sound, this time voices. Low, almost a whisper, but definitely human. My heart started racing, and without needing to say a word, we began walking faster toward the exit. But the faster we walked, the clearer the sounds became. It was like the voices were following us. Then, suddenly, Jake turned, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it down the corridor we had just passed through. There's someone there," he shouted. That's when I saw them. At the edge of the darkness, just barely lit by the weak beams of our flashlights, figures emerged. They weren't regular people. They were dressed as clowns, but not the bright, cheerful ones you see at kids' parties. These were like something out of a nightmare. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their masks stretched into wide, unnatural smiles. And the worst part? They weren't standing still. They were moving toward us slowly but steadily, as if they knew we had nowhere to go. Claire was the first to scream, and that broke the spell of fear that had been holding us in place. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, dodging debris and racing through dark rooms, trying to find the exit. But the factory was a maze, and the more we ran, the more lost we became. Behind us, the sound of footsteps echoed, getting louder, faster. The fabric of clowns' suits rustling, their distorted laughter bouncing off the walls, feeding our growing panic. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the faint light of the moon filtering through a broken window. We ran toward it, our feet barely touching the ground. Jumping over the fence never seemed so difficult, but the adrenaline pushed us forward. We collapsed on the ground on the other side, dirty and out of breath, not daring to look back until we were far enough away. No one said a word on the walk back home. We were all in shock, too afraid to process what had just happened. When we finally split up, we knew that night would mark us forever. We never told anyone about the clowns, not our parents, not our friends. Who would believe us? More than that, we didn't want to remember. After that night, we avoided the factory at all costs. During the day, you could still see its silhouette on the horizon, but it looked different now, darker, like it was watching us. And at night, we didn't even dare to get close. The whole town knew something was wrong with that place, but no one talked about it. It was a dark secret everyone preferred to ignore. I grew up and moved away, but I still dream about that night. About those clowns emerging from the shadows. About the overwhelming sensation of being hunted. I don't know who or what those people were, but I know one thing for sure. I've never let my curiosity get the better of me again. And if you ever find yourself near an abandoned factory in a small town, think twice before going inside. You never know what might be waiting for you in the dark. Working in telemarketing was never my cousin Sarah's dream, but in a small town like ours, the options were limited. She spent her days dealing with frustrated customers, listening to complaints, and trying to keep her patience. Nothing extraordinary ever happened in those cramped, monotonous cubicles until the call started. The first call came one night after work. The number was blocked, which wasn't exactly unusual. Sarah, tired from a long day, answered, expecting it to be some angry customer who hadn't yet given up complaining. But when she put the phone to her ear, all she heard was silence. She repeated hello a few times, but there was nothing on the other end, just a faint sound of breathing. She hung up, confused, but didn't think much of it. In the days that followed, the calls became frequent. Always from blocked numbers, always the same pattern. She'd answer, hear the breathing for a few seconds, and the person would hang up. Sarah started getting nervous, but there still wasn't any reason to panic. Maybe it was just a prank from some bored teenager. But everything changed in the third week when the voice finally spoke. It was a Friday night, and Sarah was relaxing on the couch, watching TV when the phone rang. She answered automatically, already tired of the strange game. At first, the same silence and breathing. But then a male voice whispered, "Sarah." She froze. This was the first sign that whoever it was knew exactly who they were talking to. "Sarah, you're alone, aren't you?" The line went silent again, but this time, Sarah didn't hang up. She stayed there, paralyzed, waiting for the voice to continue, trying to convince herself that it was just a coincidence. But the voice didn't stop. "Your parents are out of town this week, right?" Her heart raced. How did he know that? Her parents had left to visit relatives, and only close people knew that. Sarah hung up the phone, her hands trembling, and spent the rest of the night on edge, with the doors locked and all the lights on. In the following days, the calls became more frequent and more personal. The voice mentioned intimate details about Sarah's routine, where she lived, the time she left for work, the places she frequented. He knew what she was wearing on certain days, and even what she bought at the store that week. Sarah changed her number, thinking that would solve the problem. For a while it worked, but like a nightmare that refuses to end, the calls started again, this time even more terrifying. By now, Sarah was terrified. She went to the police, who began an investigation. They searched for hackers, tried to trace the number, but every lead quickly ran dry. There were no signs of her phone being hacked, and the block number led nowhere. Even with all the technology available, they couldn't figure out how the man knew so much about her. And that was the scariest part. He didn't need to hack her phone. He knew where she was, what she was doing, because he was close. Too close. After weeks of living in this nightmare, Sarah started to notice something she had never considered before. Some of the information he mentioned could only have been observed if someone was nearby, very nearby. She began to look at the familiar faces around her. The mailman, the neighbors, even her coworkers. Everyone seemed suspicious now. Every look, every smile. They could all be the man on the other end of the line. She moved to a new apartment on the other side of town, desperate to leave it all behind. For a few days, the calls stopped, and she started to believe that maybe she was finally safe. But, of course, that didn't last. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, the phone rang again. The number was blocked. The fear came rushing back, but she answered, almost out of reflex. On the other end, the voice whispered something that made her blood run cold. "Nice try, Sarah, but you know you can't escape me." This time, he laughed before hanging up. The last time I spoke to Sarah, she was living almost in isolation. She had quit her job and distanced herself from almost everyone, even her family. The police never figured out who the man was, and he was never caught. But the calls continue. She no longer knows who to trust or where to hide. All she has is the silence between the calls, waiting for the next whisper. And sometimes, I wonder, what if he's closer than she thinks? If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. Living in a small town in Texas had always meant peace and quiet. Not much happened around here, and I actually enjoyed the slow pace. My apartment was in an old building, but it was comfortable enough. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and each neighbor had their own well-established routine. At least, that was how it was until the apartment next to mine, 104, became a mystery that would rob me of sleep. It all started subtly. A few weeks ago, I began hearing noises coming from the apartment next door, slow footsteps and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought the place had been rented, maybe by a new tenant moving in. But something didn't add up. The building manager had mentioned that the apartment had been vacant for months, ever since the previous tenants suddenly moved out. Yet the noises continued. Every night, around midnight, the footsteps would start again. They sounded like they belonged to a single person, walking back and forth. Then came the sound of furniture. Sometimes it was the scraping of a chair or something heavier, as if someone were rearranging the place. The strangest part was that it never happened during the day, only at night, when the building was enveloped in silence. After a few sleepless nights, my curiosity got the better of me. During the day, I approached apartment 104 to see if I could hear anything or notice any movement. I knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. No sound at all. This only increased my frustration. How could there be so much noise at night and no sign of life during the day? Frustrated, I decided to speak with the building manager again. I went down to his small office on the ground floor and explained the situation. He looked at me with surprise, as if he had never heard of noises in apartment 104. "Are you sure you heard something?" he asked, frowning. "That place has been empty since Mr. Peterson moved out. No one's living there now." The certainty in his voice made me question my sanity for a moment. "I swear, I hear noises every night," I insisted, the unease growing inside me. "Someone is living there, or at least coming in." The manager hesitated but promised to check it out, though he seemed skeptical. The truth was, I knew something strange was happening, and if he didn't find out what, I would. That night, the noises came back, louder than ever. This time, besides the footsteps and the furniture, I swear I heard a muffled laugh, soft and disturbing. My heart raced. The feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. I couldn't sleep, staying up until dawn, determined to solve this once and for all. The next day, I went to the manager again. Tired of my persistence, he finally agreed to give me the spare key to apartment 104 to check it out for myself. "But you'll see, there's nothing in there," he said as he handed me the key. I wasn't so sure. Something inside me told me there was more than just an empty apartment. When I opened the door to 104, the air inside was heavy, almost suffocating. The dim light filtering through the dusty curtains showed how abandoned the place seemed. Everything was exactly as I expected. Or almost. As I walked through the living room, something caught my eye. On the floor, deep and uneven marks, as if furniture had been dragged back and forth, just like I had heard every night. My stomach churned as I realized the marks were fresh. Whoever had been here, it wasn't long ago. I kept exploring, my heart pounding. It was in the kitchen that I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the back of one of the cabinets, behind empty cans of food, were crumpled pages from a notebook. As I opened them, I saw hastily scribbled words, disjointed phrases talking about them, and "I can't escape." The notes were disturbing. They mentioned voices, whispers at night, and the constant feeling of being watched. My fear spiked when I realized some of the things described in the notebook eerily resembled what I had been feeling the past few days. What was happening in this place? Who had left that notebook there? And why? I rushed back into the hallway, shaking. On the floor in the living room, more marks. Something was wrong, and now I knew that someone or something had been there recently. I decided to leave before something worse happened, quickly locking the door behind me and returning the key to the manager without a word. He seemed unconcerned, but I could barely hide my fear. That night, the noises continued, but this time, I heard them more clearly. Heavy footsteps, furniture being dragged, and that laugh. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't sleep. I felt a presence on the other side of the wall, something that shouldn't have been there. And now I knew that whatever it wasn't just my imagination. Life in the building went on, but I could never feel comfortable again. Apartment 104 remained vacant, or at least that's what the manager said. But every night, I heard the sounds. I knew someone or something was in there, even if no one else believed me. Every small town has its tragedies. Those stories whispered in hushed voices at family dinners and on street corners, keeping the past alive. In my town, that kind of story is the fire in the tailor's garage. What started as a horrible accident ended up revealing something far darker and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. To this day, when someone mentions the name Brian Taylor, the mood changes and an uncomfortable silence takes over. I remember that day well. I was a senior in high school, and it was a regular afternoon until word began spreading through the town. There was a fire at the Taylor's house, and everyone knew Brian was inside. He didn't survive. At first, the fire was blamed on a short circuit or maybe an accident involving some equipment in the garage. But what no one knew at the time was that Brian wasn't the innocent victim we all thought he was. Brian had always been a quiet kid, the kind who stayed under the radar. He didn't have many friends and seemed to prefer it that way. I knew him from school just in passing, really. We exchanged a few words here and there, but he never gave off any signs of strangeness. However, after the fire, rumors started to circulate, things that no one had noticed before. Offhand comments he made in class, dark stares, disturbing sketches in the margins of his notebooks. Everything started to fall into place in a chilling way when investigators entered the garage and found something no one expected. Among the charred remains, they discovered materials that, according to the police, were being used to build a bomb. A real bomb, something that would have caused unimaginable destruction if it had been finished. The revelation shook the entire town. It took a while for people to process the idea that the quiet, overlooked kid was planning something so horrific. But the worst part came later. When investigators searched Brian's room, they found a journal. I remember hearing about it through whispers at school, and the rumors spread like wildfire. The journal was filled with detailed notes, almost like a manifesto of his hatred for the school and the students. He described his plans to destroy the place, his contempt for his classmates and teachers. He even named people he wanted to hurt, describing their deaths with sickening detail. It was as if we had been living with a monster, and no one had noticed. The teachers were in shock, the parents panicked, and everyone at school began questioning what could have been done to prevent it. How did no one see the signs? The dark sketches, the muttered words, the stares. Everything seemed so obvious now. But back then, Brian was just another outcast, and most of us were too caught up in our own lives to notice how deeply he had sunk into his quiet rage. As time passed, the story faded, but the scar it left on the town never fully healed. To this day, people talk about how it could have been much worse. And it's true. If it weren't for that fire, if the garage hadn't caught fire that day, Brian might have carried out his plans. He was so close. Maybe through carelessness or fate, the fire stopped him from completing his horrific scheme. And that's what scares me the most, the closeness of the tragedy, the feeling that we came so close to becoming another statistic on the national news. I think about Brian a lot, about what must have driven him to that point. I can't justify what he planned, but I also can't ignore the fact that at some point he was just a kid crying out for help in a way no one understood. Maybe if someone had paid more attention, if one of us had tried to talk to him, things could have been different. But now, all that's left is the memory of that lonely boy and the journal that almost turned our town into a nightmare. I grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knew each other, and the streets were deserted after dark. It was the sort of place where the most exciting things that happened were high school football games or gossip about who was dating whom. At least, that's what I thought until the day my neighbors simply vanished. The couple that lived next door was quiet, but friendly enough. The Adams, that's what everyone called them. They were reserved, childless, and lived a peaceful life. Most of the time, I saw them walking their dog, a German Shepherd that seemed to be the only thing they really cared about. On weekends, they'd have barbecues in their backyard, and the smell of charcoal smoke would drift over to my house. mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass. In a way, it felt like the perfect symbol of the calm, uneventful life we all lived in that town. Then everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed something was off. Their dog, Rex, was on their porch whining. I found it odd because the Adams never left him outside for long, but I figured they had gone out and would be back soon. By evening, Rex was still there, and that familiar feeling of unease began to settle in. Their car wasn't in the driveway, and the lights in their house remained off. The following days only made the situation worse. Rex became more frantic, barking through the night and scratching at the front door. I didn't know what to do. I asked other neighbors if they had seen the Adams recently, but no one had a clear answer. Everyone seemed puzzled by their sudden disappearance. The police were eventually called, and officers came by a few times to investigate. They entered the house, but there was no sign of foul play, no sign of a hasty departure. It was like they had simply vanished into thin air. The entire town was shaken. Speculation ran wild. Some people said the couple had run off, maybe involved in something illegal. Others whispered about the possibility of kidnapping, though there were no signs to support that theory. Despite the police investigation, no leads surfaced, and no one had any concrete answers. As time passed, the case grew cold, and eventually, it faded into the background, just another strange story to tell over coffee or at dinner parties. But I never let it go. I passed by the Adams house every day, the overgrown lawn and peeling paint reminding me of the unsettling mystery that had taken root in my quiet neighborhood. Rex was eventually adopted by one of the older neighbors, and life went on, but that gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong never left me. As the years went by, I became more suspicious, not in a way that I could explain to anyone, but in the way I looked at people, at my other neighbors. I started to wonder what they were hiding behind their closed doors and polite smiles. Who really knew what was happening in the houses around us? There was one couple in particular, the Johnsons, who lived across the street. I'd always found them a little different. They weren't very sociable and spent most of their time indoors, with their curtains always drawn. I remember that during the time of the Adams disappearance, they seemed the least interested in what had happened. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it felt like they were indifferent to the whole mystery that had gripped the town. After the Adams vanished, the nights grew longer. Every noise out of place, every strange shadow put me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that house next door. Were they gone by choice, or had something far worse befallen them? And if it was the latter, who was responsible, and why? I still live in the same house, and the Adams home remains vacant. Every now and then, someone asks why the town never solved that mystery. But the truth is, everyone gave up trying to understand. The police moved the case to the back of some dusty file drawer, and the town moved on, pretending it had never happened. But I haven't forgotten. Every time I walk past that empty house, with the wind rustling through the dead trees in the yard, I wonder, what really happened to them? And the worst part? I think I'll never know. When I moved to this small town in rural Illinois, I expected peace and quiet. After years of working as a nurse in crowded, high-pressure hospitals, I was finally able to retire. My new house was cozy, with a spacious garden and a beautiful view of the countryside. It was the perfect retreat for my later years. It didn't take long for me to meet the neighbors, all friendly, especially Mrs. Collins, who lived next door. Mrs. Collins was a widow in her 80s with mobility issues. Soon after I arrived, she told me that she relied on a caretaker to help with daily tasks like cooking and cleaning. He seemed like a quiet man, always dressed in simple clothes with an unreadable expression. I often saw him taking care of things for Mrs. Collins, carrying groceries inside, and sometimes hauling large, heavy bags out of the house. I assumed they were just trash or old items she no longer needed. But as the days passed, I began to sense that something wasn't right. The caretaker's behavior started to unsettle me. Whenever I stepped out into the garden or went to check the mail, There he was, watching from a distance. It was subtle but noticeable. A prolonged glance, or that feeling that someone was watching you out of the corner of their eye. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination or the reclusive nature of a man who spent his life caring for someone else. Still, something felt off. A few weeks passed, and I noticed the bags he took out of Mrs. Collins' house were getting bigger and more frequent. At first, I didn't think much of it, but one hot spring afternoon, while tending to my garden, I saw something that made me shudder. The caretaker was once again carrying one of those bags, but this time the bag looked strange. It was too heavy, with an odd shape, as if something bulky and dense was inside. He loaded it into the trunk of his car with unsettling ease and drove off quickly, not even noticing me. In the days that followed, Mrs. Collins stopped appearing around the house. She used to sit by the window, reading or watching the outside world, but now the curtains were always closed. The house is silent as a tomb. I found it extremely odd, considering her usual routine was so visible. I still saw the caretaker coming and going, but there was no sign of her. I tried calling Mrs. Collins a few times, but the phone was never answered. That's when my concern really began to grow. I decided to check on Mrs. Collins in person. I knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. The caretaker wasn't around at the moment, and the house seemed deserted. The silence was oppressive, and I could feel a chill running up my spine. Something was deeply wrong, and I knew I had to do something. That night, I contacted the local police. I explained the situation, describing the caretaker's strange behavior and Mrs. Collins' sudden disappearance. They sent an officer to the house, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The door was opened by the caretaker himself, who claimed that Mrs. Collins was resting and that everything was fine. The officer seemed satisfied and left, but I knew he was lying. In the days that followed, I grew increasingly suspicious and anxious. The caretaker continued acting oddly and seemed to have noticed that I was watching him. He began spending more time outside Mrs. Collins' house, and often I caught him watching mine. Sometimes when I went out for errands or walks, I had the distinct feeling he was nearby, quietly following me. Then, one afternoon, I returned home to find something that chilled me to the bone. The back door, which I always locked, was slightly open. I entered cautiously, my heart pounding, and as I walked through the rooms, I knew someone had been there. Things were out of place, cabinet doors left open. It was subtle, but enough to convince me that my house had been invaded. A wave of absolute fear washed over me. What terrified me even more was the realization that the intruder seemed to know my routine. Everything was disturbed in places where I kept important things, documents, keys, personal belongings. What was going on? At that moment, my mind went straight to the caretaker. He knew where I lived, knew my schedule. Worse, he always seemed one step ahead. I immediately called the police again, demanding they investigate more thoroughly. I knew he was involved in Mrs. Collins' disappearance, and now he was after me. I could barely sleep, fearing he might break in again or do something worse. In the days that followed, the police finally returned to Mrs. Collins' house, but this time it was empty. No sign of her or the caretaker. The house was sealed off as part of an investigation, and for weeks, the entire town was in shock over the elderly woman's disappearance. To this day, no one knows for sure what happened to Mrs. Collins, but I am certain that the caretaker wasn't acting alone. He knew far more than he let on, and what frightens me most is the thought that somewhere out there, he's still at large, watching, waiting. And maybe he's watching me again. A few years ago, during the summer, I went to visit some relatives in a small town in rural Kansas. Those trips were always a nice break from the routine, far from the noise of the big city. My cousin Sarah had lived there her whole life, so she knew all the interesting spots, from hidden lakes to roadside diners only locals knew about. It was at one of those diners that everything happened, something that, to this day, sends a chill down my spine every time I think about it. It was late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah suggested we stop at a small diner, a really simple place off a quiet highway. The place had that classic small-town charm, with old wooden tables and a basic menu. It was the kind of diner you'd expect to find truck drivers and families returning from a day out. We went in, ordered our food, and everything seemed completely normal. While we were sitting, chatting about random things, I noticed a man walk through the front door. At first, I didn't pay much attention. He looked like just another customer, although he seemed visibly nervous, with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, despite the heat outside. I could feel a tension in the air, but I didn't understand why. Sarah, sitting across from me, also went quiet for a moment, and that's when everything changed. The man approached the counter, and I saw him pull a gun from inside his jacket. My first reaction was disbelief. This doesn't happen here, I thought. This kind of thing is what you see in movies, or maybe in big cities, but not in a small diner in the middle of nowhere. The man pointed the gun at the cashier and yelled for him to hand over all the money from the register. "Let's go, hurry up," he said, his voice shaking. The place fell into complete silence. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, as if it was about to leap out of my throat. Sarah gripped my arm under the table, her face pale, and I knew she was as terrified as I was. The cashier, trying to keep calm, obeyed the man, opening the cash register with trembling hands. The robber began stuffing the money into a backpack he had with him. The tension in the diner was suffocating, like the air had suddenly become heavier, and each second felt like it stretched on forever. I couldn't take my eyes off the gun. I don't know if the man was more nervous than he appeared, or if it was just our own anxiety making everything seem worse. But in that moment, all I could think was, what if he sees us? What if he decides the money isn't enough? The idea that he could turn on any of us was terrifying, and the helplessness of the situation was what struck me the most. We were completely at the mercy of a stranger, in a place where no one really knew us. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally took what he wanted and bolted out the door as quickly as he had entered. Still holding the gun, he ran to an old car parked across the road and disappeared in a cloud of dust. For a moment, no one moved. Everyone was in shock, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we heard the distant sound of police sirens approaching that reality started to return. Someone, maybe the cashier, had called 911 during the robbery. The police arrived quickly, and within minutes, they were scouring the area. We found out later that they had managed to catch the man not far from there, abandoning the car on a back road. He hadn't gotten very far, which gave us a strange sense of relief, like justice had acted fast enough to stop something worse from happening. Sarah and I stood outside the diner for a while after the police finished taking statements. We were still in shock, our hands trembling as we tried to process what had just happened. Sarah looked at me, and all we could do was let out a sigh of relief. We were unharmed, but the weight of the fear still hung over us. We got in the car, and as we drove away from that diner, the world felt a little more uncertain than before. What was supposed to be just another peaceful visit to family ended up being marked by an incident I never thought I'd live through. To this day, every time I stop at a roadside diner, I think of that man, the gun in his hand, and how life can change in an instant without warning. It was one of those humid summer nights in the Midwest, where the heat still hangs in the air even at midnight. My friends Ethan, Jack, and Katie and I decided to meet at our schoolyard to kill some time. The school, in a small, sleepy town in Indiana, was surrounded by cornfields and dirt roads, a place where nothing exciting ever happened. But that night, something happened that none of us would ever forget. We were sitting on the concrete benches near the basketball court, talking about nothing in particular, when Ethan noticed it first. "Is someone coming?" he asked, tilting his head toward the school gate. At first, we thought it might be just some adult returning from a bar or a curious neighbor. But as the man got closer, we realized he didn't fit into any of those scenarios. He was walking slowly, with a strange, forced smile on his face. And even in the darkness, you could tell something was very wrong. He stopped about 15 meters from us, raised a hand, and waved like he was our friend. "Hey guys," he said in a voice that sounded almost cheerful but had a note of unease that made my spine tingle. "I've got something really interesting to show you. You should follow me." The way he said it was enough to make me uncomfortable, but Jack, being the boldest of us, responded, "What's so interesting?" The man hesitated for a moment, his smile widening in a way that wasn't natural. "Come with me and you'll see. It's not far from here," he said, taking a step closer. That's when I noticed something glinting in his hand. At first, I thought it might be a reflection from the distant streetlight, but then I saw the metallic shine, a knife. Small, but sharp enough to make us panic. Silence fell over the group. I felt the adrenaline surging through my body, and for a second, none of us knew what to do. Katie was the first to react, grabbing my arm with force. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Ethan was already standing, ready to run, but the man took another step forward, still holding the knife casually, like it was a toy. I said, "Come with me. I don't want anyone to get hurt," he insisted, now with a disturbing intensity in his voice. Everything happened so fast after that. Jack pushed Katie to run, and I was already sprinting in the opposite direction. I heard the sound of our feet hitting the asphalt of the schoolyard as the man yelled something I couldn't make out. All I knew was that we had to get out of there fast. We ran as if our lives depended on it because in that moment, it felt like they did. As soon as we reached the houses, Katie pulled out her phone and called the police while the three of us tried to catch our breath. We reported everything. The man, the knife, the sinister invitation to follow him. The minutes felt like an eternity as we waited for the police to arrive, our eyes fixed on the dark, waiting for him to appear again. But he never did. When the police arrived, they searched the area for almost an hour. They checked the surroundings of the school, nearby parks, even the neighboring streets, but the man had simply vanished. They asked if we had noticed any specific details, his face, a car, anything that could help. But aside from the knife and the unsettling smile, we didn't have much to offer. They told us not to worry, that it was probably just someone playing a prank. But we knew it wasn't a joke. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that smile and the knife gleaming in the darkness. We never went back to the schoolyard at night. In fact, we barely went out after dark anymore. What disturbed us the most was the fact that the police never found the man. He just disappeared like a ghost. To this day, whenever I pass by the school at night, I glance toward the yard, half expecting to see that man again, with that horrible smile, calling us to follow him. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 9 Japan's urban legends are extremely scary by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.